This is our August seller forms series. Today we're going to be covering 4 forms, our notice to buyers perform, cancellation of contract, our square footage lot size advisory, and our authorization to receive and convey information. We pulled all of these because they're either mentioned in the residential purchase agreement or our residential listing agreement. Then going in alignment with this one would be our cancellation of contract, with Adriana had been asking about. So our cancellation of contract, remember we serve that notice to perform whether on the buyer side or seller side. We serve the notice to perform. We got to wait 2 days before we can cancel. Unless it's a close escrow. If we're demanding that the other party close escrow because they're delaying the close of escrow, that's a 3-day demand to close escrow with a separate form. So just kind of keep that in mind. I believe it's a DCE form, is demand to close escrow. That can be served by either party as a demand, and there's all sorts of implications there, but we would also send over that cancellation as well after that one. But just know that everything in the contract, if it's not being performed on, is either a notice to buyer to perform or a notice to seller to perform, except close of escrow. That is our demand to close escrow. I did cover this form in the buyer one, so just kind of keep that in mind as well, but we're going to do this as if we are the seller now. So we have our cancellation of contract form. Keep in mind that we are not qualified to provide any opinion as to who is entitled to deposited funds or whether a cancellation was made in good faith. Buyer and seller are advised to seek advice of a qualified California real estate attorney regarding the matter. Okay, there is a couple different parts to this form. Okay, first one is the cancellation. Either party can do the cancellation, and it does not need the approval of the other party to cancel a contract. Okay, now whether they're in breach with their cancellation or not, that's between the buyer and seller. So one party cancellation. This paragraph is used to cancel the agreement by buyer or seller. Its terms apply whether or not both parties agree to the disposition of the deposit and cancellation of escrow in paragraph 2 below. So buyer and seller signing below cancel the agreement for the following reasons. So we're going to say, hey, we're the seller canceling the agreement. Okay, and then we're like, what exercise are we using? Usually for our sellers, it's going to be 1A2, which is buyer has failed to remove the applicable contingency or taken the applicable contractual action after being given a notice to perform. Okay, so that's usually for our sellers what we're going to use. We're going to serve that notice to perform form that we just went over, and then we're going to fill out this cancellation. The other option here that we're going to use maybe for a seller is the other party has failed to close escrow after being given a demand to close escrow. Okay, so those are usually the two that we see. Buyer has failed to perform, or we haven't closed escrow, and so we're canceling. Now, the other options that you have is if the sellers have contingencies in place. Usually the contingencies that we see for our sellers are going to be our seller's purchase of replacement property, which means they have to identify or close on a replacement property. Then that's going to fall under 1A1, generally speaking, or you could put it under 1A5. Okay, but you would cancel based on that contingency. So just kind of keep that in mind. Proposed mutual cancellation. I don't ever recommend this unless both parties have just decided that, man, we're done. Buyers don't want to buy, sellers don't want to sell, whatever reason might have happened. Then it's proposed mutual cancellation. You're going to put it in there, but usually it's one party is canceling or the other. One party usually doesn't want to perform. If a buyer's agent sends this over to me and says proposed mutual cancellation, they're canceling based on the inspection contingency, I'm going to kick it back to the buyer's agent and say this isn't mutual. The sellers don't want to cancel, so fill it out appropriately and send it back over, just because I'm mean. So generally it's going to be either the buyer or seller cancels. Whoever's going to cancel the contract signs this top line here. Okay, so let's say that we say, hey, buyer failed to remove the contingencies or take the action, then seller's going to sign here. This is going to be seller. Okay, right? Seller's going to sign. Now, Section 2. So once we sign this and send this first page over, the contract is canceled as far as we're concerned. The second section, though, is what happens to the deposit and is escrow actually canceled? And for escrow to actually cancel the transaction, they're going to need instructions from both parties. So they need everybody to agree that we can cancel the transaction. So, this is paragraph 2. Okay, there's lots of options here. One is it lets people know that, hey, the release of funds is not automatic. We need it signed by mutual release instructions or a judicial arbitration award, right? And there's a civil penalty for up to $1,000 if you refuse to sign the cancellation of instruction or the cancellation with no good faith dispute. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. That's you can use that a lot to get this document signed. Full release and disposition of deposit. Select one of the options in C or complete D, but not both. So we're either going to select one of the options in C for full release, or we're going to come down here to D and select partial release, but we can't select one in C and select D because that doesn't make sense. So our options here for full release is, hey, the seller authorizes the release of buyer's deposit back to buyer, less buyer's fees and costs already incurred. Right? So for the most part, this is what we see for the majority of our transactions. Most of the time, if a buyer sends us cancellation or if the seller is sending the cancellation, well, it's the deposit usually goes back to the buyer. The only time the buyer doesn't go or the deposit doesn't go back to the buyer is if the buyer's removed all their contingencies and now the buyer is failing to perform and we're canceling on that buyer. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. Most of the time, the buyers, it's really hard to keep the buyer's deposit. Most of the time, it goes back to them. Occasionally, there's some forms where like the seller agrees to pay buyer for out-of-pocket expenses for things like inspections and appraisals. You're usually going to see that in the seller's purchase of replacement property form, the SPRP that we covered last week. Buyer's going to deliver receipts and then seller's going to reimburse the buyer for those costs if it's the seller canceling the contract. So just kind of keep that in mind that there is a box there for that. C2 is buyer authorizes the release of buyer's deposit, less seller's fees and costs already incurred and agreed to, right? This is going to go back to the seller. So this is the buyer releasing the deposit to the seller. The buyer's admitting their feet. They're in breach of contract. They remove their contingencies. They no longer want to move forward with the purchase. They're saying, I'm done. Take my deposit. I'm walking away. Okay. Now, keep in mind that the release of the deposit is limited to either the actual deposit made or 3% of the purchase price, whichever is less, assuming it's an owner-occupied property. So if the deposit was 4%, buyer is authorizing the release back to the seller. Seller's only going to get 3%. 1% goes back to the buyer, assuming that everyone has signed the liquidated damage clause in the purchase contract. Okay. If the liquidated damage clause was not agreed to, then this section of this paragraph does not apply. Buyer authorizes the release of blank from buyer's deposit to seller. So maybe there's a portion of the deposit that's going to the seller. Okay. Or 4 is there's no deposit in escrow. Each is going to pay for their unpaid contractual fees and costs already incurred and agreed to be paid through the close of escrow. So those are your options for full release. Okay, it kind of gives you a partial release here because you can release some to the buyer, some to the seller, but the whole deposit's getting released. So your option is it goes back to the seller, it goes back to the buyer. First one is buyer, second one is seller, third one is, hey, we're going to split this up. And then fourth one is the buyer never actually made the deposit in escrow, so there's no deposit to be released. Okay. Now D, so remember we're either going to select one of those 4 options or we're going to select D, which is partial release and reservation of rights. And this is saying, hey, that we're agreeing to cancel escrow. Okay. We are releasing each other from the obligation to buy, sell, or exchange the property under the purchase agreement, but we reserve all rights and retain any obligations they have towards each other under the agreement, except for the obligation as applicable to buy, sell, or exchange the property, which means that we're going to go to battle over this deposit. This is usually what this means, right? We're going to authorize the escrow holder to hold the deposit until receiving subsequent mutual instructions, judicial decision, or arbitration award, or there is no deposit in escrow. Okay, and then buyer and seller are going to sign this section. So usually, if I'm a seller, and my seller's like, yeah, buyer's failing to perform. They still have their loan contingency in place. We asked them to remove it. They're not. I'm canceling and moving forward with another. As I provided in the notice to perform, seller's going to sign this line here. And then I'm going to come out and say generally seller, because the buyer still has their loan contingency. They're not actually in breach of contract. They're just failing to perform. So generally speaking, the deposit goes back to the buyer. We don't have a right to retain it. Are you okay with that? They're going to say, yeah, that's fine. We're going to check this box here that, hey, the seller authorizes the release of buyer's deposit. Buyer's going to sign that top line, or sorry, seller's going to sign that top line, and seller's going to sign down here. We're going to submit this over to the buyer for cancellation. Once the buyer signs here, we submit it over to escrow to release the deposit, and then we can move forward with a new contract. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Any questions about the cancellation of contract, disposition of deposit, and cancellation of escrow?
No.
No.
All right. Fabulous. That wraps up our forms for today. Again, we had that notice to buyer to perform, our cancellation of contract, our square footage and lot size advisory and disclosure, and our authorization to receive and convey information. And we'll be back next week. Let's see here. Let's see if I've got it pulled up. It doesn't look like it because I was going to tell, oh, it could be on the calendar. Let's see what's next week. Thursday. We have next week, we're covering the solar form, which is super important. It should be included in all transactions with solar, but we're not seeing it often enough. Our request for repair, our SXA, which is seller's intent to exchange, and our WFDA, which is our wildfire disclosure and advisory. So we'll be covering those forms next Thursday at 9 o'clock, same link. If you want to suggest trainings for our training series that will start up in September for the fall, there's a link in the chat box you can click on, and you can let me know what trainings you would like to see. Oh, and on August 28th at the end of the month, so in like 2 weeks from today, we have Bob Brand coming back, who is our staying out of court expert. He is fabulous. He'll be on at 9 o'clock on Zoom. He is the one that did our Avid training, and then I can't remember exactly what was covered under the last training. I think it had more to do with disclosures, but he always has some really good information. I even learn from him every time I listen to him. So he'll be here on the 28th, so make sure you tune in for that one, and we'll see you next week.
All right.
Amy.
Thanks.
Yes, Adriana.
Do you have like 3 minutes?
I have 3 minutes. Jake,
Okay.
I'll reach out to you in the next day or so. You'll hear from me, and we'll just touch base, make sure you've got everything that you need to get started.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.